I'm proud and excited that Bill Finnegan is here tonight. He barely got away from the New Yorker, where he has a election campaign related profile closing at this very moment, or paused briefly, I guess.
Paused ungraciously and ill-humoredly by my colleagues. I gotta go.
But he has his priorities right. He's here. And all of you obviously are passing up Mass on Fifth Avenue to be at this important event, so thanks. I finished Bill's book this week, which made me very sad. I had been reading it in little pieces, and it's been a part of my life for many days now, and it's that kind of book. You get to know the writer, and you get used to the storytelling, and it just becomes something to look forward to every day. So I'm saddened by this conclusion, but I'm looking forward to being able to talk about it. At the end, if you'd like a copy, by the way, there's a small number of them on the table for sale, right, Rob? Yes, you can write checks. Oh, Bill will sign them.
Yeah.
If he is so inclined. Bill may sign them. Here's a quick introduction. William Finnegan is the author of this book and 4 earlier ones, including 2 about South Africa under apartheid, 1 about the war in Mozambique, and 1, Cold New World, about people not doing so well in an America where many are thriving, including memorably the first piece of his I ever read about a 15-year-old drug dealer in New Haven. He's a staff writer at The New Yorker, and as you'll hear, a lifelong surfer. His famous 2-part New Yorker piece from 1992, Playing Doc's Games, is about surfing in San Francisco with a hardcore surfer doctor. It's a sort of milestone piece for many people, including a surfer writer I was with this summer who said, "We've all been waiting a long time for this book." His name's David Morris, by the way. He told me he was slowing down toward the end because he didn't want it to finish. He also told me that Tom Wolfe's piece from the mid-'60s, The Pump House Gang, about surfers in La Jolla, is sometimes considered the beginning of surf writing in this country. Maybe we can ask Bill about that. But I know that surfing magazines, particularly in Australia, have been the literary mainstay of surfing for a long time, even though, unless I'm mistaken, they consist mainly of photos. Is that true? Okay.
The photos are far more important than the prose.
Okay. This book begins at Kaimuki, is that how you say it? Kaimuki Intermediate School in Honolulu in 1966, which is a tough and fascinating world. Bill was moved there with his family from Los Angeles, where his father was a TV producer. On page 19, I'm just going through today. This is from that first chapter. "I saw Surfing That Day" by Leslie Wong, among others, that made my chest hurt. Long moments of grace under pressure that felt etched deep in my being. What I wanted somehow, etched deep in my being, what I wanted somehow more than anything else. Sorry to botch the first quote from Bill's book, but it's about a very visceral interest in and engagement in surfing that connects all the other interesting parts of his life. The book goes back in time from Hawaii to Los Angeles, where he started surfing, and then returns to California. The author matriculates at UC Santa Cruz. I'm not sure. I think there's a little Montana phase in there, and then begins a 4-year odyssey around the world, most of it in search of good surfing. Is all that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. Past the fact-checking phase. And my first question, Bill, is that in your first books, you've written in the first person. You've written in the first person elsewhere, but this is completely different. It's a deep exploration of yourself, your family, your friendships, especially with male surfers. Those seem to be the deepest relationships. Is this Brian DeSalvatore in this picture? This is Bill's companion for 15 months of the adventure, and they're like an angry couple who often can't stand each other, and yet they stick together for, well, complicated reasons. The book was a long time coming, and obviously one of the things you have to do in a book like this is invent yourself in a way. Was that a hard thing to do? Was it hard to figure out who would be telling this story, or was it obvious?
Well, first of all, thank you guys for coming out, not following the Pope uptown. It's true that in most of the stuff I do, long-form narrative for the New Yorker, or not even so long, there's a first-person character that you have to decide whether or not to deploy. And then if you think, yes, this piece needs a narrator, the I character, you have to decide what that character's function is going to be and what they're going to be like. Are they going to be a fool, or are they going to be somebody who's figuring it out as you figure it out? All kinds of functions, of course, for the first person. But and I have the freedom in the kind of work I mostly do for the magazine and in my other books, which are much more journalistic than this one, to sort of consider and invent that character and make it multifaceted. But basically, the job of that character is journalism, is reporting, is trying to understand what's going on. This is quite different, and a lot of the work of writing a memoir, as this is to kind of suppress the journalist and not be embarrassed to make yourself the story and to turn the spotlight on yourself for extended periods of time and resist the temptation to just describe and tell and describe. In other words, move the spotlight onto your companions or onto whatever scene you find yourself in. And so the first person in here is not a simple kind of fixed set of elements to serve a story. It's sort of out of control, really. I wrote this over years and years. It's a big, fat book, as you can see, and it follows me from childhood to, last week. So I have both the contemporary view of myself at different periods of my life, and can be, fairly arm's length about my foolishness at different points, and my, hopes and pains and moments of triumph and what have you. But I can also sort of enter into it in a novelistic way, so that the distance collapses between the grown-up old guy writer and the young character you're reading about. I mean, young and then not so young, and so on. So it's not simple. I mean, for a lot of the pieces I do, I could say, well, for this piece, that first person character you'll see appears here, gets it wrong, appears here, gets a laugh, appears, it works this way, but here I'm just all over it. You mentioned this piece I did for the magazine back in 1992 called Playing Doc's Games. It was actually the first assignment I had from the New Yorker. I'm going to ramble a little bit
Go right ahead.
and explain how this book came about, because I sort of backed into this book via that magazine piece. I was living in San Francisco in the 80s and freelancing, and sent a short piece into the New Yorker, a short political piece. That's mostly what I write about, is politics, very broadly defined. And I sent a little piece over the transom, which they took. The first thing I sent to them, first thing I sold them. And somebody in the editor's office said, this would be a good time to propose, something longer. And so I felt like I had to do it like in 10 minutes, like right now, this is my chance. I didn't have any ideas. So I sort of scrabbled around and quickly said, okay, and proposed a profile of this guy I was surfing with, this doctor, surfer, sort of larger than life guy, who was kind of, I don't know how many of you read John McPhee, but he was sort of like a John McPhee hero from the sort of mid-period of McPhee's career, which was then. And I got the assignment. And then I'm not John McPhee. I couldn't possibly write this piece the way I'd proposed it to them. And I also suddenly thought, what, surfing? I mean, something was something I'd been doing since I was a kid, and now I was 30. But I had never written about it, didn't really think about it. It wasn't really part of how I saw myself. It was just this thing I did, almost this bad habit, while I was trying to sort of get on with other stuff, like writing and reading and being in the world. And I was quite embarrassed I couldn't figure out how to write about it, and then I wasn't so sure. By the time, it took me 7 years to write that piece. Missed a couple of deadlines in there. And by the time I finally finished it, I'd moved to New York. I didn't just sit and panic for 7 years. I moved to New York, and I'd published maybe 3 books, in fact, by the time that thing finally came out. So I was working on other stuff. And I joined the staff of the New Yorker and was writing all kinds of stuff. And developing more inhibitions about sort of coming out of the closet as a surfer, because I was writing about politics and I was writing opinion pieces, so I thought, do I really want to, you're probably aware of the sort of stereotype of surfers and slackers, stoned out guys without much grip on the rest of the world. And so I had this idea that, this piece would come out, and various people I was engaged in argument with publicly over, politics, policy, would suddenly not take me seriously. Oh, you're just a dumb surfer, we don't have to listen to you, sort of thing. And so I had other inhibitions about that piece, but I finally finished it, and they ran it. And big, this is back in the days of multi-part. It was a 2-part piece, like 40,000 words. And made kind of had got a lot of attention, and led to, my publisher wanted to bring it out as a book. I had more material, it was sort of book length, but one of my inhibitions about writing it was that one of my hesitations about finishing it was that I was afraid the main character, this doctor, big wave surfer guy, I was afraid he wasn't going to like it, and indeed he hated it. The idea of publishing the book was, and I just didn't want to rub his face in it anymore, and I said no, I didn't want to do this as a book. But I started telling surf stories to my editor and saying, I've surfed with more interesting people than this in other places, more interesting places. This just happens to be some place I surfed recently. And the more I dug this hole for myself. She said, write that book, I'll take that book, you know. So I said, that's the way which I sort of backed into it, and then it was another 20 years before I finally got it done. But one of the hardest things about writing it, not that it was all so terribly hard, but weirdly, I had this very finished piece, and I said, you know, maybe that San Francisco story will be a chapter in this big set of sort of surfing set pieces I'm going to write, and that was the hardest chapter to write. It was already written. It was, you know, quite finished. It was all fact-checked and edited, and 40,000 words of, you know, fairly worked prose, and yet it just it was indigestible. It didn't belong in the book, and it took me, I think, years in the end of work, just coming back to it and coming back to it, trying to sand it down, trying to tear out all the magazine-y stuff, even though it wasn't an ordinary 40,000, it was not an ordinary little magazine profile, sports profile or something. Still, it had all these qualities that made it not belong in the book. Sort of, it was like the book was rejecting it like a bad transplant. And I would go through it, and it sounds like I'm exaggerating, but I can't tell you how many times I went back to it and said, if I could just get this fucking San Francisco chapter right, you know, just rake all this stuff up, and kind of move the spotlight to myself. Okay, there's this guy I'm surfing with, and a lot of the book is about friendships. I mean, that's sort of the main topic of the book in a way, is these male friendships. But that one wasn't a really, I mean, I had this assignment to write about the guy, so it wasn't a sort of normal or natural or there was something tainted about this, you know. I mean, I had to sort of stay on good terms with this guy because I had an assignment to write about him, big, you know, career break. And so if he was annoying, I wasn't going to tell him to, you know, take a hike. I needed him, so I would put up with stuff I wouldn't put up with from the next person. And so but it still belonged in the book as a different sort of friendship. But it wasn't a profile of this guy. I mean, that threw the whole book off, and it sits strangely, I think, in the book. No matter how many times I went through it and tried to make this part of my memoir, and then I'm living in San Francisco, and my life is like this, and I'm surfing with this guy, and here are the places we're surfing, and here are the things that happen. It was really, really hard to wrench it round to, and it's a departure in tone, even after 50 drafts, where I sort of cede the stage to that guy and his kind of local rival. They're sort of the big guys in that little surf scene at the time, and they're kind of it's almost a sort of corny contest between them, and I sort of step back and let them, and maybe I think some people read that now and enjoy it for being a break from me. Now we get to watch something else, and I become more of a reporter, more of a journalist, but it never did get really sanded down into the shape.
That's interesting. It's a very, in my experience of a reader of this book, it's a small part. It's less than a fifth. It's probably something like that.
It's like
much.
1 of 10 chapters, yeah.
Yeah. One of the pleasures of the book is meeting this character before he's a published writer, before he's a New Yorker writer, when he's a kid being hassled. He's an ethnic minority at his high school. There's a big guy who sits at the back of the shop class and likes to tap him on the head with a 2x4.
Tap is a euphemism.
He's in fights with all these people. Apparently there were fights all the time when you were a kid.
Certainly at that school, yeah.
There's a party where somebody urinates on his head, even more specifically toward a certain part of it. You see him not as you see him today, and it's a play.
We hope.
There is a girlfriend who brings up, or no, it's one of your male friends who brings up the deodorant question, and you can't believe it. And you ask your girlfriend, and she kind of nods and agrees that maybe deodorant is a good idea. And there's so much in here that's...
We were hippies.
They were hippies. There's so much in here that's very funny and very self-deprecatory and completely unexpected and off the wall, and not at all easy to connect to a successful literary career years later. And the surfer stigma is part of it. It's been troubling Bill for years. Karen, is that how you pronounce her name, or Karen?
Mm-hmm. Karen, yeah.
He hears that her friend has reported she's run off with some surfer. There's this great passage, I think in Tonga, you meet a woman from Texas who berates you for being a surfer. She said you could be in the middle of an earthquake and all you'd be wondering about is, is there a good wave connected with it, which you would ride 5 times, and then what? Where does that leave you? And there is this voice of people making fun of surfers, but then there's a very different voice, which is of a disciple of surfing, not just the flashy side, but of studying water and studying places and studying weather and becoming an expert in all these things that have to be right before surfing can happen. Would you be willing to read this passage, Bill? The book has many descriptions of water, of surf, and no two are the same. And I picked 3 or 4 at random and asked Bill if he would read one. Does this still look doable?
Yeah, sure. Let me
You're welcome to pick a different one.
Explain it a little bit. I was in the South Pacific looking for waves for a long time and ran out of money and landed up in Australia. And it was all very comfortable, the West after a long time in the third world and camping and we got jobs. My friend Brian and I, that cover photo was taken in Australia. And settled in this place in southern Queensland called Kira, which at the time had a very famous wave, a sort of legendary wave. And then we waited for months for it to come alive with these northeast cyclone swells that worked there. I say it was because they changed a dredging scheme at a nearby river and it disappeared. This wave, often considered the best point break in the world, just vanished under a underwater sand dune, and so it's not there anymore. So when I tell knowledgeable surfers or old-time surfers, guys who know what Kira means, that I lived there in the 70s, they turn green and say that's impossible. But we did, or I did for one season. So this is, it's really interesting to listen to you talk about, I'll read this in a second, some of the kind of demeaning reflections from the civilian world on surfing. My first girlfriend, old friends of hers, whatever became of her, off with some surfer, and to them just like the most unlikely, inane fate, and it didn't really affect me that much, but it's just every now and then just to, sort of reflect how we're seen. But I mean, most of this is written from inside. I mean, it's all written from inside. This, I think you used the word discipline or discipleship. You're in this cult, which is very intense and demanding and kind of life-consuming, and it's a pretty serious addiction. And I take it seriously, and when I try to get away from it, I'm always falling back into it. And so passages like about surfing, by this point in the book, we're halfway through the book almost, the reader is either inducted or not inducted. I mean, they'll put the book down if they're not, but I mean, you're deep into it, so I can say, this is different from Honolulu Bay. Well, I dropped out of college for a wave called Honolulu in Hawaii, on the island of Maui, and just lived for this wave for a long time, or not so long, but for a while. And so those comparisons by this point in the book are all, you know what I mean when I say it's different from Honolulu in this way. It's not like Tavarua in that way, because we've been to those places and lived for those waves. And now it's a new place, Kura. I'll read this passage and another little thing after it, because there's a thing right after this that I like. It didn't have the open ocean size or broad-faced beauty of a Honolulu Bay. It was a far more compact, ropier wave. The first 100 yards had an amphitheater feel, with spectators lining the jetty at the point, the guardrail along the coast road, a steep green bluff that rose behind the road, and even sometimes a parking lot in front of the Kura Hotel, a large plain pub tucked under the bluff. Beyond that, it was open beach, and when the swell was big and the angle was right, a ride could run on for another 200 yards, unobserved, an empty, ecstatic racetrack. It wasn't a mechanical wave. It had flaws, variety, slow patches, closeouts. Concussion wavelets off the jetty or the inside bar often ran back out to sea, marring the third or fourth waves of a set. But the cleaner waves had a quality of compression that was sometimes literally stunning. The heaviest waves actually seemed to get shorter. They gathered so much force as they began to detonate across the main bar, a shallow stretch known as the Butterbox section. Even with a sand bottom and a makeable-looking wave, it was a deeply intimidating section. You had to come into it fast, but stay low on the face. Be ready to duck when the thick lip threw horizontally, and then somehow stay over your board through an ungodly acceleration. The Butterbox section gave new meaning to the old surf imprecation, pull in. There was only one way to make it, through the barrel, pulling in. It goes on a bit about Kura, comparing it to various other places we've seen and surfed, and then about how violent it was. And one of the main things about Kura was it was insanely crowded. Countless number of people, and with a terrible, terrible down coast current. You couldn't stop paddling hard the whole time if you wanted to surf. If you even said hello to somebody or took a breath, you lose 5 yards, and the pack would surge by you. It was just this paddling contest all day long, and with some really, really good surfers and some super fit local guys. So there's a long, long pecking order about who would, and at the top of it were, sort of famous and world champion surfers. But I say all this just to say that, I got really, really into it and sort of joined the mob and tried to sort of like work my way up the pecking order. And so this little paragraph will make a little more sense, knowing that. Brian and I had the advantage of living about as close to Kura as it was possible to live, unless you lived at the Kura Hotel, which had no rooms. I checked the jetty every night on my walk home from work. I had a job as a bartender. I checked the jetty every night on my walk home from work, and if there was any hint of a swell, we would hit it before first light. It turned out to be a great surf season, one of the best in memory, people said, with at least one solid swell virtually every week in January and February. One cyclone, Carrie, smashed through the Solomon Islands, and then seemed to drift around the Coral Sea for weeks, pumping out powerful northeast swell. Our early morning go-outs were often fruitful, yielding fresh waves with, for an hour or two, relatively few people. There was a regular pre-dawn crew, not all of them especially hot surfers. There was a gawky, friendly, bearded guy who rode a big wave gun, hardly turning at all, and who always yelled as he jumped to his feet and said his line, "I got a lady doctor." I happen to know the next line in that song. "She cured a pain for free." And she did. It goes on like that.
Many of the men Bill meets are identified by the music they like. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yeah.
That's a great example. Could we talk about your first efforts to publish nonfiction? Was it those articles you co-authored with Brian for, Tracks?
Yeah, probably yes. I had done a few things in college or in graduate school, some criticism.
So you'd already gotten your MFA when you set off? Okay.
Yeah. This trip that time in Australia was part of. I was gone for almost 4 years on that trip looking for waves. And it's strange how, going back into it, trying to account for why in my mid-20s I left the U.S. for 4 years. I kept extensive journals. I didn't ever make a decision to do it. It was just mandatory in the world I grew up in to somehow, if you got it together, if you saved some money, that's what you had to do. And I had got an MFA. I had a job on the railroad in California. I'd saved some money, a good job, and it just, now I'm 25. I've never even been to the South Seas. It's just, I've got $5,000. I have to go, and so I went. And I talked this friend of mine who had a job teaching in Guam in the Western Pacific to meet me, and he was also grown up as a surfer. He's a few years older than me, also a writer. And I said, "So we got to do it." And he said, "Yeah, it's true, we do. We have to do it." It wasn't there wasn't a kind of self-consciousness or a discussion. It was just like, mandatory. So we went, and your question was about writing. And we were both novelists. I'd done an MFA in fiction and was working then on my third novel, which was set on the railroad. And Brian had written a couple of novels. All these novels were unpublished, kind of sitting in drawers. But when we got to Australia, we had an idea. They had this wonderful surf magazine there. We'd sort of lived through surf magazines, or I'd grown up on them. And they're just kind of glossy, a lot of surf porn. And yet there in Australia was where surfing was much more mainstream. Surfing culture was kind of deeper and wider, and this magazine called Tracks actually was came out on newsprint every 2 weeks. Was kind of the youth culture, like maybe Rolling Stone was here once upon a time. It was just kind of like the main text, and it was also a surf magazine, so it was strange, and it was not a kind of glossy surf industry magazine at all. It had a really aggro attitude, just ridiculed the advertisers and was really foul-mouthed and funny and completely different things. Wonderful thing to run across called Tracks. And so we got a notion that we would write something for them because they were sort of up to our literary standards in a very rough-hewn way. And we decided to write about what it was like to come into Australia, where There were, signs, surfing beach and car parks and showers, and it was all so mainstreamed, and clubs and clubhouses and contests and school teams and so on and so on. We'd come out of a whole different, in Southern California, I think it was true on the East Coast too, surfing was not, my high school would sooner have, put us in jail than given us a surfing team. Surfers had a very bad reputation. There were beach towns where they actually outlawed surfing, and the cops forever hassled you. It was kind of constant struggle between surfers and police. And we were rebels, we were cool guys, and yet here was this new thing. So we thought we'd make fun of it for tracks, and so we did. We wrote a piece together, and it turned out to actually be this kind of disaster in our relationship, because I'd never written anything with anyone else, and neither had he, and we couldn't agree on anything. Every paragraph he wrote, every draft I wrote, he hated, or I hated. What are you thinking? Really sort of bitter disputes and more belittling, him saying, do you aspire to mediocrity? What, and we'd been friends for years and really bonded, not so much over surfing as over our respective literary tastes and ambitions and passions, and we mostly liked the same books and liked the same things about them, and we had differences, but suddenly it was just like trying to write this little thing together, this little ditty for tracks. These differences that were developing at the time, and I was getting more interested in a kind of transparency. And plainness and clarity of writing, and he was just still. I had started out as a kind of teenage lyric surrealist, so I was making a long trek over to comprehensibility, and Brian was determined still very much on the what he once called the incredible foot-stomping joy of a well-turned phrase. It was just all about the language. And so, to me, he was overwriting everything, and to him, I was underwriting everything, and I ended up crumpling up the manuscript and throwing it at him. He stormed out rather than punch me. We were quite the squabbling couple, living in this little bungalow in Cura. And finally, I said, you just do it. I don't want anything to do with it. But he wanted my name on it, so we sort of compromised, and something I could stomach, and we put both our names on it. But we used our real names, and we were working at the time. We didn't have work visas, so we were working under fake names. Illegal, not undocumented exactly. Anyway, we were illegal workers, and so this piece came out and made quite a splash, which we didn't expect. Like locally, it was surf country. We lived in this area of Queensland that was wall-to-wall surfers, and people were really annoyed. And I heard from other people I was working with at this bar, have you seen this thing that these American wankers, wrote? And I said, no, what? And people didn't recognize us because it was under our real names, and we lived under these other names. And so we just decided to. People were really annoyed because we were making fun of how lame and mainstream Australian surfing was, and just making, laughing at it. And they really, this part of tracks was they hated Americans. They called us Seppos, right. For short for septic tanks. Rhyming slang with Yanks, and that was usually it was just dickheads. They just really didn't like Americans. And that was part of their shtick. And then here were these Americans right in their magazine saying, you guys are clowns. And so we stayed quiet about that. So that was, yes, my inglorious and co-written entry into the life of nonfiction.
I don't want to ask too many more questions because I want to offer other people the chance. But I'm curious, did you show the manuscript to Brian before you published it?
This?
Yeah.
No, and he hasn't read it either.
No kidding. Are you still friends?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, voluminous correspondence.
Yeah, you refer once to page 15 of his letter.
Yeah.
Or was it your letter to him? I can't remember, but
yeah, I quote from the.
It was a literary friendship as well as a.
Yeah, in fact, we were much better, and we are much better as sort of epistolary friends than as like living together.
Do you think he will read it?
He says he will eventually. I did a lot of fact checking with him, and in fact, I used his journals a little bit. Once when I was really blocked a few years ago, I asked him what he remembered about some place where we lived and surfed or looked for surf in Western Samoa, and he got out some old journals of his and finally agreed to share some of them with me, and he sent me Xeroxes of journal pages with lots of stuff redacted. All, I'm sure, complaints about me.
That's right. That's Seppo.
Yeah, and because when we were living together in very close quarters, just they had a little tent and camping in the South Pacific, and my journals were full of complaints about him as well. But his journals were so good. The pages he sent me were just so. I said, "Can I steal this? Can I steal that?" It's such great stuff, and it wasn't even so much that I needed to steal stuff. It was just that it brought it all. I mean, they were so sensory. I mean, he wisely would go into the village shop and write down everything on the shelves, and that just would bring the place back to you. My journals were long things about why my railroad novel wasn't going well, or like stuff that's just did not particularly chronicle the South Pacific the way I would have if I'd known that I was later going to write a book about it. So I fact-checked a bunch of things with him, and this happened with other friends too, really amazed to see how wrong I had so many things. I mean, with friends in particular whom I had kind of just glorified or improved upon through the years. Oh, and then, of course, yeah, well, when Brian was in college, he was good friends with Jack Kerouac. Everybody knows that. Well, no, not exactly. I mean, Brian sort of sticks to the facts. And, you were correspondents. I mean, he was in Yale in the 60s. And he said, no. And it turned out, you covered his funeral for the Yale paper. Okay. That was the truth. Right. So there was a lot of sort of crashing down to the facts in the fact checking with him and with other people, and lots, of course, really delicate negotiations because memoir, especially maybe for a reporter, I mean, it's a very weird genre. As a reporter, you end up sort of investigating your own life, your own, reporting out your own past, and which includes, and of course this is all private life we're talking about. Everything was off the record, and now you're, giving yourself license to write about all these shared, unguarded moments with friends and loved ones, and that's a big arrogation. You have to think long and hard about what it's okay to put in and what's not, and then talk to people and sort of negotiate that with them, and going back to these sort of long lost friends and frenemies, about
and girlfriends
and being quite surprised in some cases, thinking this is never gonna. How am I gonna do this? Like going to somebody who I described her life as one long middle-aged orgy, and I thought this is never gonna, and then it turned out she said, "Really, you wrote that? That's great. It's true. That's fantastic. It's going to be in your book."
Is this Karen's mom?
Yeah, who's like 89 now. I'm very happy to be remembered that way. And other people, perfectly reputable episodes, they're appalled that this stuff might be in print.
So you would change it?
In some cases, I just take things out, yeah, or tamp things. I mean, some of the characters I think are only half drawn at best because the people themselves are quite interesting, quite strong characters, but it's just not okay to depict them in their full difficultness. They didn't ask for that, and they don't deserve it. And everybody has to. I mean, my agent kept saying, "Oh, come on, you got to have that sliver of ice in your heart, you know." and you do. In fact, strangely, speaking of 89-year-olds, the mother of an old friend who's in her late 80s just listened to the audiobook of this. I mean, reading's getting difficult, and she said to her son, who's my friend, he didn't have to be this nice to us, because I wrote about their family. And she said, and especially you. She said, you were, what did she say? Something about him that was so true. And what did she say? Something about, like, you weren't this nice one day in your life. And it's true, this guy's really mean and a really sort of destructive gossip and an impossible guy. And I rendered him he's not a major character, but I've rendered him quite blandly, really, compared to what he was. But I just couldn't see, and especially what becomes of people, because a lot of these are sort of sketches over long periods of time, and not everybody's life turns out well, and not everybody's character flourishes, and what of that is yours to tell the world. I mean, this is not going to be an obscurely published book. In fact, it's actually sold really well so far. And what are you doing to old friends or people who sort of trusted you with their secrets, their friendship, and then you depict them in a way that's very painful for them, but exciting for readers. Where do your responsibilities lie in all that? So that's why I say memoir is quite a weird genre, period, but particularly maybe for a reporter, because so aware of, people know you're a reporter, or on the record, let's talk. And this is the opposite of that.
I have many more questions. I would like to assign a student to write about machismo in this world and in how you dealt with it, how you have to be careful how you describe a wave. You don't want to make it bigger than it was. Like there's people will look down on you if you exaggerate. You don't say it, but I'm guessing there's also a positive value placed on not talking about your injuries, because you don't until a stunning passage on page 222. You won't believe the number of bad things that have happened to Bill. He's thinking about the toll the sunshine takes on Australians.
Oh, I looked around there and saw my future, all these sun-ruined
cataracts in people in their early 20s, right? Mm-hmm. Which you yourself already had. My years in the freezing ocean in Santa Cruz had given me exostoses.
Yeah, it's ear problems.
Bony growths in the ear canal, which were trapping seawater. He had 3 operations on his ears, broken nose, torn ankle cartilage. Late in the book, there's a perforated eardrum. There's a scene of him getting dashed against the rocks in Portugal, like repeatedly. And then somehow you make your way home where your wife puts you in the bathtub, and all I know is there's blood in the water, and but the specifics are withheld from us. I'm not going to ask Bill to account for this. I just want you to know there's lots of there's a lot more that could be said in terms of suffering and the downside of things.
Well, there is a sort of character in the world of surfing, the gnarly dude, whom you, it sounds sort of like Jeff Bridges, but this is different. One aspires to be that person, and I'm certainly not. But like the main character of the Moderator chapter, the next to last chapter, kind of is. And these are just people who manage to sort of do things that other people can't in big waves and difficult ocean conditions, and do it with real panache. And there's a very, very strong code of, not complaining about bumps and bruises and that kind of stuff in surfing. So I think of machismo, which I wrote a lot about Mexico and spent a lot of time in Latin America, and I've written a lot about machismo, and has a kind of social part that involves the disenfranchisement and oppression of women. And so I never think of surfing as particularly macho. That's not the word I would use. But there is a very strong sort of ethic of trying to make it look easy and trying not to look scared and all that kind of stuff.
Would you entertain a couple of questions?
Oh, let's. If people have questions, I'd love to hear them. Yes.
I'm not sure I've ever heard of a writer working for so long, or I guess not working on a book, and I'm wondering, when you finally finished, if you felt a great sense of relief or of loss, or maybe both. And I'm also wondering if you could speak a little bit about what it was like to write about something that was and is a huge part of your life, and something that you were so passionate about, and if at times, if nostalgia was at all like its own kind of writer's block, or if it was sometimes just too hard to write about this this huge thing that's such a part of you. I'm just curious about that.
Well, nostalgia is a this book's not, I don't think, nostalgic, if I understand the meaning of the term, in the sense that it's got, I do have all these old journals, and I'm enough of a journalist that there's a lot of sort of reality checks on these. I mean, in the world of surfing, a lot of people who've read this have told me this book is not about surfing. So it's a little, talking about it as a surfing book, and they'll say it's about men, it's about love, it's about something else, obsession. But for surfers who read this, and there are plenty of those, there are some periods. I mentioned Cura, Once Upon a Time in Australia, some other places even more so maybe, that are considered nowadays, that was the golden age of surfing, this place at that time. And they're almost all wrong, because somehow in surfing, like when I was a kid, everybody was incredibly when I was 9, I was already nostalgic for some golden age I'd missed. And everyone was crowded and spoiled already as far as I was concerned when I was 10. And that kind of runs through surfing. There's something in surfing which is this thick current of the good old days type stuff. And this book, I hope, is not infected with that. I think it's not. As I say, it's got a very strong kind of reality check, and the stuff even in sort of tender youth is full of sort of fear and struggle and sharp-edged memories. And actually writing about surfing I had the experience of doing that big piece for the New Yorker, where I was making a big effort to write about surfing for non-surfers. And some of the attention that piece got, in the surfing world, was, somebody has finally done it. Somebody from the tribe who will never, Tom Wolfe is a great example of somebody coming from the outside and trying to write about surfing. I've never heard a surfer say a good word about that piece. It's just considered, a bad moment in journalism, in the sense that he didn't get anything or anybody right. And he couldn't describe a wave or what people were actually doing surfing, because he doesn't
Didn't have the language.
Didn't have the language and didn't probably even make the effort. But even if you did make the effort, you just couldn't do it. I mean, it's like it'd be as if, I decided I'm going to learn enough Russian to write a short story in Russian. I mean, the language is that. It's not a full-blown language, of course, but it's just, you can tell in half a sentence if somebody knows what they're talking about when it comes to surfing. And it's true in many disciplines, I'm sure. But here I was, somebody who'd been surfing my whole life, so if I describe a surfing scene, other surfers will know what I'm talking about, and we're speaking the same language. And here I'm writing for the New Yorker, and I'm writing primarily for non-surfers. And one of the many things I found about that piece when I went to do this book, adapting it, I found it so corny. I found it really bad in many ways, and it got a lot of praise, really, and even in the surfing world, it's still around. It's like the magazine piece that won't die. It's 23 years, and people still throw Xeroxes of it in front of me. So it had this life, but I almost don't see why. I mean, I know it was the first crossover piece, the only big crossover piece, and maybe until this book, but it's a lot of. I mean, my editors made me write little potted histories and Gidget and this crap that I didn't want to write, but I felt like I had to put in there to get it across to New Yorker readers, and was happily tore it all out. It's not in here. This is really more the true voice of it, and so this thing attempts to bring readers, great majority of whom are not surfers, into this world. In the first chapter, you sort of learn the terms that you're going to need to know, and then you don't hear them again. And if you don't remember, you're going to be lost. I mean, I really don't bend over backwards to say, and this is what that is again. And a set, remember, is a group of waves, which blah, blah, blah. You learn what a set is, or this is a channel or a barrel or whatever, early on, and then you know it, and you treat it as if you know it, and it's written as if you know it. And so the thing of sharing something secret and private and meaningful to oneself with the world in general wasn't, I don't know, I guess there's actually a lot I held back and decided, no, that's too private. But there was a passage that Ted mentioned, would you want to read this as we were coming in here? And I said no, because it's about a wave ridden in a day in a place in Fiji, and it was very emotional. It ends with this kind of very emotional scene, and various friends of mine like to rag me about it, and won't let me. Oh, you're gonna sob again, and making me wish I'd never written it. So there are places where I disclose a little more than I wish I had. So there were places I pulled back, certainly. And to your multi-part question, finishing this thing finally, relief, loss. I don't know, I'm still kind of writing it in my head. I mean, I still wake up and think, too late, the book's published. I can't really refine that point or, bring out the other aspect that I'd forget. No, there's not going to be a second volume. And so there's a little bit of a phantom limb feeling when something that's been around this long, and always sort of taking notes. And a lot of this, we're talking about the surfing part, but a lot of this is about my family and friendships and love life, and I'll think of something my dad said. Oh, that's right. That really gets it, but it's too late unless I'm going to write more about my dad, who's no longer with us. That's it. I can think about it, but I'm not going to write about it. So it's quite hard to let go in many ways, differently from journalistic pieces.
How much more time do we have, Rob? Okay, so you can call on who you want.
Yes.
When you were working with Brian and other people to sort of go through your memories and fact check things, did you find it helpful to share the way you remember the incident, or did you find that somehow colored their memories and made it more difficult for them to work with people?
That's a good question, because with some people I think I'm going to tell them how it was and try and barrel through and make them agree that's how it was. Because just, depending on the person and the incident, I don't want to get into this discussion about it. I'm going to say, don't you remember it was like this? I'm just going to really try and push it through. Other people, I was much more passive and, what do you remember? More like a journalist. And a lot of times we'd end up arguing, and I know my memory wasn't perfect, and it really depended sort of on how much I trusted the person's memory. I mean, some of the friends I had to do this sort of thing with are eminently untrustworthy. I mean, they're just full of shit, everything has been turned so many times in the telling, especially if it was some big adventure or something, that it no longer resembles the historical fact. And so that kind of person would require one approach, and let us agree to disagree, but it's, and then listen closely to what might be true and, that actually does correct what I've mythified or erased somehow. But other people I think have better memory than I do, or they kept better journals than I did. My first girlfriend, Karen, kept fantastic journals, and she let me, again, heavily redacted.
Oh, really?
Let me read some journal from our years together. And they were so good. I said, can I quote from these? She said, sure. And I do. I mean, she was a much better writer than I was. And funny and just mordant. I mean, just wonderful stuff. And of course, some people, hate to be written about. Including me, I don't like being written about. And so I'm really grateful to people who swallow that and say, it's your book, go ahead. And I'll really understand what it is to write a book of your own memories that involve other people who will remember everything differently and who understand that and who have the kind of literary sophistication and also generosity of spirit, just say, and if I don't like it, I can write my own book and really kind of see that, as opposed to just, no, if I'm in it, it's got to be told, and you get all variations of that spectrum, of course, in this kind of project. So, some people are quite unhappy with it. Yes?
Yeah, I get the sense surfing's grown a lot in the last 20 or 30 years. True. Since you've been writing about it. Is the body of literature, when you get kind of the Tom Wolfe point and then your story 92, has the body of literature evolved or grown with the industry, or do you feel like you're more of a few people on the wave still with that? And is that good or bad?
Well, it has grown disastrously, surfing. I mean, there are people who are happy about that, mainly corporations that are making money out of the growth of surfing. And then all surfers are unhappy about it because it just makes it more crowded. I mean, I don't know any surfers who want to see surfing in the Olympics, but oh boy, the surf industry wants to see surfing in the Olympics. So we're kind of at odds, those of us who do it and those who manufacture, I don't know, surfboards, wetsuits, sunglasses, whatever. And surf literature, I haven't been that, I read stuff that comes along. My favorite books about surfing are really technical. I grew up on a book called The Surfing Guide to Southern California, which I virtually memorized. It's just this wonderful book. And there's a history of surfing and an encyclopedia of surfing by this guy, Matt Warshaw, that are just really erudite, wonderful, eccentric books. And then it turns out that this book came out recently in Australia, and review after review says, this is so unlike the usual surfing book. And they have like this shelves and shelves of surfing books coming out in Australia. And this book stands at a certain place in the shelf. It's actually an ordinary surfer, not a world champion's, autobiography or memoir as told to so-and-so.
You're talking about your book.
Yes,
yeah.
and over these reviews, of course, refer to this, unending wave of surf literature, but none of those books are published in this country. So they don't, I don't think any of the reviews this book's got in this country is referred to any other surfing book, because as far as the reviewers know, there aren't any others. but there are tons in Australia, and quite a few here too, but not maybe. I mean, I think some of these books are bestsellers in Australia. I'm told, and they're sports books sort of. And surfing's quite mainstream in Australia. Surf stars are well-known celebrities. I mean, I don't know how many people here know any professional surfers. Do you know the names of any professional surfers? Couple? One?
He's from California.
Oh.
I grew up in a surf town in Northern California.
Oh, then you might have a different. But in general, in this country, like surf contest. What's a surf contest? People, you know, in Australia, people know exactly. You know, his third wave was certainly an 8, and you know, the man on the street sort of knows it's. And surf champions are celebrities, and not true here. And so there's a surf literature of sorts there, which I mean, mostly this book in reviews there has been favorably compared, like oh, finally a book by a, and it's not as if in Australia they think I've done anything extraordinary, like traveling around the world for years and years and, you know, living under a palm tree to look for waves. That's what we've all done, according to his reviewers. Finally, a guy like us, a normal bloke, you know, sleeping under a palm tree his whole youth trying to find waves. And which you would never get here. I mean, here it's more like, this guy was nuts. He, you know, like went to the South Pacific and slept under a palm tree for years. So, but there are kind of people who specialize in this area and do anthologies and so on. And so it's out there. And there's some kind of lively surf journalism, mostly again in Australia. Some lively writers. But it's fairly disposable stuff. You know, it doesn't end up in books too much. It's just funny, irreverent, kind of got to know the characters type stuff. Yes, sorry.
I was just curious if there was anything that you got from living in sort of that tribe surfing world that you transferred over to your professional career, or that helped you in your professional career. And I'm just curious if you still surf.
I still surf, yeah. In fact, we're excited that this weekend. I mean, there've been waves all week, and it's going to pick up a lot on Sunday. So like Sunday, Monday, if you can find the right little corner with east-northeast winds are all right. But there's quite good waves around here, mainly in the winter, unfortunately, when it's freezing cold. But quite good if you have a good wetsuit. And again, you know where to go. South Shore of Long Island, north part of the Jersey Shore, all up through New England. But life in the tribe, I've always kind of been at odds with. I've had one of the best things about surfing for me in a way has been these very vivid friendships that form around it. But those are just a few people in my life. The like surfers in general, whom I have to, you know, fight for waves with, for instance, when the waves are good at a good spot. I have never been like enamored of the like sort of population as a whole. I feel like I don't have anything except surfing in common with an awful lot of guys who surf. That's not even a theme of the book because I'm not even interested in it. But there's a lot of anonymous kind of head-butting that goes on in surfing, and even to this day, sometimes I think I'm old and gray now. These guys are going to give me some respect, but they don't. They're still just as determined to steal waves from me as they ever were. And there's some way in which I think that the kind of it's quite raw competition for waves. And it's not bad around here. Strangely, surfers in greater New York, like Long Island, New Jersey, around here, are the mellowest surfers I've ever been around. You know, New York has this reputation as aggressive people, whatever. I mean, compared to California, Hawaii, other surf centers, real surf centers, people are so pleasant and so reasonable and so willing to share and chat with strangers, and in fact, it's embarrassing. You know, you sort of do anything. Everything waves a great wave as far as they're concerned. I mean, and I have enough of this kind of California superciliousness inbred in me. I mean, I recognize that they are better people than me, but I'm still kind of, you know, that was not worthy of, you know, I have this sort of higher standard built in. But in some way, I think that the rawness of the competition in the water, which isn't so raw around here, but is when I travel farther to surf. I'm going to go to Indonesia next month, which is really, really good waves, but unfortunately really, really good surfers too, and really competitive at the best spots. I think that there's something to be just totally corny about it, something character building about having that in your life. It's not polite. It's very rarely. I mean, there's a sort of idea that, especially in Hawaii and other places, that it sort of devolves into violence quickly. You know, if you cross the wrong people in the water. But that has never happened to me. I've never gotten a fight in the water, physical fight, plenty of arguments, but that thing is sort of carries over into life, where arguments in regular life they're a little less physical, less immediate, less intense, the kind of alpha male type stuff that goes on among men in life. I think I might be easier with because of all that time in the water, where it's really, you know, it's like who's bigger, who's more aggressive, who's quicker, who surfs better, but it's just real raw kind of simian dance you're doing in the water often. Yes?
I have a question. It's about the process. It's a stupid, annoying question, but I always want to know about writers. You said you had a time when you were blocked. So I want to know which part blocked and for how long, and how did you address that?
Well, I was thinking of this particular time when I was trying to write about the South Pacific, which is around the middle of the book, and I sort of got there. It's kind of juicy material, obviously. I mean, some people think, oh, that's the heart of the book. You know, you're in the South Pacific surfing undiscovered waves and among, you know, pre-industrial village societies. It's all very colorful, blah, blah. But I sort of got to there, having written my way through a lot of other stuff, and you know, there were way too many villages, and it all kind of ran together. It doesn't seem interesting. I had the material, but the material didn't seem alive, and it didn't seem to have any dramatic coherence. I don't know, maybe a couple of months. I've taken leave from the magazine. I'm here to write the book, and I am just not getting anywhere. And I turned to my friend Brian and said, can you show me some journal pages from this period, because I was traveling with him. And that broke the ice. I mean, it was just like a page. I finally got a page down that where I could smell the reef in this place and feel the cuts and hear the wind and it all started coming back to me. But it was maybe 6-8 weeks. That was bad. And then my writing habits are getting worse and worse. I'm finding I can only write late at night. Like I start really getting down to work around midnight these days. Not just on this book, but including the magazine pieces I write for a living.
Like the whole night?
Yeah, so I write best from like 12 to 5 in the morning, 12 to 6. It's terrible. So I get really ragged. Last night I worked till 4 in the morning. And so I don't know, that's not quite being blocked, but it's the next worst thing. You know, can't really get going till after midnight when everybody's quiet and leaves me alone. And I'm actually so tired that I don't have any nervous energy. I just, okay, I could do this now. And then work well, but I don't get enough sleep. I don't get nearly enough sleep. I mean, I go to bed at 5 and get up at 7 to take my daughter to school. So no good.
So you never sleep?
Not much, very, very little.
He has to go to sleep now.
Yeah.
We have to wrap it up. Thanks for good questions, and thanks for
great
listening.
questions.
And Bill, thank you for your generous and thoughtful answers.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you, guys.